got the news, no matter where you're at. This is the Bullhead Dispatch, coming to you with information across the nation, resolving conflicts and education. It ain't pretty. News from everywhere in your city, yeah. No matter where you're at, you can rely on the Bullhead Dispatch. Yeah.
You're listening to Bullhead Dispatch, a podcast dedicated to transparent and honest discussions and news. Again, it is broad, but we're only on episode 4, so we are still figuring it out. Today I'm talking with Dr. Julian Buchanan. He has worked in the area of drug policy reform and education for decades. He began as a social services provider and probation officer in Liverpool. Julian then went on to work at several universities in the UK before joining the Institute of Criminology at the Victoria University of Wellington. He maintains a strong interest in the interplay between inequality, crime, problematic drug use and drug policy and practice. This was a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion. We could have talked longer, but thanks for listening and enjoy. Started your career and how you became involved in the drug awareness field. You started back in Liverpool, was it?
Yeah. I was born and brought up in Liverpool, in basically at the end of the day, as a single parent family, because my dad died when I was 12 and was one of 5 kids. And we lived in Anfield, which is a really rough working class part of Liverpool. So that poverty and experience has shaped me a lot, really. And life never went so easy. So I didn't do well at school or anything and left when I was 17. I always wanted to get involved in social issues because my dad was a trade unionist and very much involved in politics. And I got a job in social services in Liverpool city centre. And then eventually I managed to get myself sponsored by the Home Office to qualify as a social worker, but also a probation officer. So my first job was in actually working in the field. Was as a probation officer back in 1983. So in the 80s, I'd sort of endured Thatcherism for more than I could stomach, really. And being from a disadvantaged background and seeing poverty and mates struggle and stuff, I was pretty fired up, really, when I could see what was happening in Bootle. And I was a probation officer in Bootle in 1983, and Bootle got called Smack City back then because since the war, I think a lot of people had all their living memory had jobs for life, as they thought it. They worked in the coal mines, they worked in the shipyards, they worked in Dunlop's factory, Tate and Lyle factory. And in people's living memory, these jobs would last them a lifetime. But in the late 70s, it became apparent that there's deindustrialization and things were changing. And so what happened in Bootle is basically it's north of Liverpool, and it's a densely populated working class area, not similar to Anfield where I grew up. And but all of a sudden there was like massive unemployment, and in being a probation officer, I did some research in the office, and 90% of our caseload on probation were unemployed. It was like devastating, but it hit the young people particularly hard because their parents had lost their jobs, and these kids who've been going through education thinking that they'd get a job, all of a sudden, for the first time, it doesn't seem that odd to us now, but it was odd in the early 80s, late 70s. It became apparent that these people were not going to get work. And that was quite a trauma, really. And so what happened then is loads of young people started using heroin and also started injecting benzodiazepines, particularly temazepam, which were jelly eggs to help people sleep. And they would inject the goo from the middle and shove it in their veins and stuff. Heroin was largely chased initially, but then soon went into injecting. So there's young people, lads and girls who were on my caseload. And now initially, I grew up in a sort of my dad was very atheist and socialist because of the troubles in his background with the family splitting Catholic versus Protestant. His sister was Joyce McCartan, who became a peace activist who went to see Hillary Clinton. So she married a Catholic and became, because my dad's background was a Protestant. But anyway, that's another story. But I became a committed Christian early on in my life as a teenager. So I never took drugs. And the dominant discourse at that time was like, drugs are evil and drugs are going to kill people. And because drugs have been around in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, but by and large, the people who took drugs in that era, 50s, 60s and 70s, they were people looking to enhance their life experiences. So they would take acid, or they might take heroin just for the euphoric experience, or they might take cocaine or whatever. Or speed, so they can enjoy and stay awake all night. But the drugs in the 60s, the people who used drugs in the 50s, 60s and 70s were by and large people of privilege who wanted to enhance their life. Whereas I was now confronted, as a lot of Britain was, it was largely these outbreaks of heroin in the areas where there was most deindustrialization, where there were political strategies to undermine and dismantle working class industries. And so there was just this awful experience in Bootle and in North Liverpool generally. And similar things were happening in other big cities across the UK. But rather than taking drugs to enhance, these people were taking drugs just to simply cope with what's happening in their life. And they were just blotting out, basically. They were achieving what I would call a euphoric oblivion. But I did what I thought was right at the time. And I thought, I'd never taken drugs and still haven't, illegal drugs, that is. And I just thought, well, do what we should do. We should get these people off drugs. And I was working as a probation officer with loads of young people, something, mainly between the ages of 17 to 26, 28 or whatever. And I cared a lot for their social environment. I cared for them. But I was actually I realized at the end of about a year or two, I was screwing their lives up. Because what I was doing is pressurizing them to become drug-free. And so I was a probation officer, and the whole world wanted them to become drug-free. So basically, if they felt like they were not ready, or they never wanted to, or they couldn't face life, so they weren't going to give up these drugs, because these drugs were helping them cope, really. But all we were doing, the parents and all the authorities, was putting them under pressure to become drug-free. So what they'd do is, I'd be writing a report for shoplifting, and I'd go to the judge and I'd say, he or she, they really want to give up drugs because that's what they told me. But they only told me that because I was pressurizing them. But a load of money came to the probation service, to the education service, to the social service and the health service. Pub priming money, and this was really largely on the basis of, we'll cure this problem because this is a transient problem, it'll go away. We've never had the working class normalization of drugs before. We've had pockets of drug use at festivals or amongst university students, but we've never had. And where I was, back then, it was in Bootle. It was before mobile phones. And before mobile phones, basically people would have to call in at the houses to get the drugs. And, there was like Earlham Heights, this a tower block, and people were actually climbing the wall of the outside tower block to go and score their drugs and stuff. It was mad, really. And police were just largely sitting outside watching to gather data to try and get somebody a bit bigger and whatever. Regularly, they would get the small fry possessions all the time, but it was just like chaos. You'd see people coming off the train, the Southport train to Bootle, and loads of people come from different parts to try and score drugs in Bootle. So with this pub priming money, I was appointed a drug specialist in Bootle. They appointed two of us, and I started thinking, this is not right, this doesn't make sense. So I went on courses and things and tried to learn. And when they gave me 4 months to try and do some research to make sense, to develop a strategy. Now, in that time, we developed the Mersey model, and I went to meet loads of people. John Marks, Rowdy Yates, went to meet other workers, Pat O'Hare, Russell Newcomb, and a lot of these characters are still big in the drugs field. They've made big inroads, really. So what we did is, I could see that a lot of this information I had on drugs was misinformation, and I thought that people died on drugs, and that's just not true. I thought that people's gaunt experiences or awful lifestyles was to do with drugs. It wasn't. It was to do with their eating habits and being marginalised and isolated and excluded. Anyway, in the end, I started working with a few others in the health service, and we worked together and as a group of people and set up a community drugs team and set up harm reduction. So I initially called it risk reduction, and I managed to persuade the Merseyside Probation Service to adopt a whole drug policy based around harm reduction, which I called in probation risk reduction. We were prescribing injectable heroin and abstinence basis. So I've moved from this sort of abstinence position to this position now of giving people clean drugs, no questions asked. There was no pressure to give up drugs. If you are ready or wanting to reduce, then let me know. But in the meantime, because the reason why I did that is because not only because I realised that heroin doesn't kill you. If you can take clean heroin every day for the rest of your life, and it won't really damage your life, it won't even damage your body. It'll give you constipation. If you're a woman, it might stop your periods or whatever, but they're temporary situations that will not. So there's no long-term damage. If you take alcohol every day, it will damage the organs of your body and stuff. So there's all these revelations I discovered in this sort of research period. So if you give people clean needles and give people clean drugs, I realised we can reduce crime, because half of these characters I was meeting, they're spending all their day going round trying to shoplift, trying to sell the stuff that they've robbed to try and get money to try and then buy drugs and stuff from people they couldn't necessarily trust, and they had no idea the purity, they had no idea what they're injecting. Whereas I gave them a clean legal supply, and then all of a sudden their life can become stable. But of course, drugs wasn't the problem, drugs was their solution. The real problem for them was a sense of hopelessness, a sense of being discarded, of not being able to see a future, of not being able to leave home, not being able to get a job, not being able to start a family. And so, although I provided stability with clean drugs, you still had a hell of a lot of work to do in order to help them to recover. So, their problem isn't drugs. Their problem is much wider than that, really. So that's how I moved from, and that's how I got involved in drugs in the first place. It was partly driven by a passion for social justice. An initial ignorance, really, but that was an ignorance shared by almost everybody and was a dominant discourse. And then a realization I was screwing people's lives up and I was part of the problem. But then having a bit of a sort of revelation that actually there's a whole new way here. This is just most of this stuff around drugs that I've been taught around drugs and addiction. It's a lot of misinformation, it's a lot of propaganda, and then delivering with a group of other people. And I worked with John Marks at the Drug Dependency Unit, and so that made a big impact, really, yeah.
Yeah. Did you find that then the class has a lot to do with it then? So when the epidemic hit of the 80s, that the lower and working class communities, or even now, are always hit harder than with drugs, or it seems like they are, but it's actually problems that they've had before drugs, then it just exacerbates the problem.
Yeah, spot on. No, that's exactly the issue, to be honest. I mean, there are people who say things like drug addiction is an equal opportunity employer. We can all become drug addicts. And there is some truth in that we can all become drug addicts. We can all develop addiction. I don't like the term addicts, but we can all develop addiction to drugs. But that's not the problem. I think what I'm working with is chronic addiction. So yes, we can all fall into difficulties, but the people who get stuck in drug addiction, the people who get chronic, are by and large, again and again, from all my research, are people who've had very damaged lives before they began developing a drug problem. By and large, they are working class people, not exclusively working class people. They can be middle class people who were sexually abused or had a very difficult or damaged life. But by and large, a lot of the people are people, they're all people with damaged lives, but overrepresented are people from working class backgrounds, or people who are marginalised and excluded. People with learning difficulties, that's another one. I mean, the same group of people also populate the prison population. So if you get any research on the prison population, you'll find people with mental health problems, people who've attempted suicide, people who didn't complete education, people who struggled to get qualifications. It's the same gamut of people for whom advanced capitalist society doesn't really want their labour. And that's what happened. That goes back to the transition that happened in the 80s, where pre the 80s, working class people who were unskilled or semi-skilled could sell their labour. But after the deindustrialisation, which was escalated under Thatcherism, the working class populations, whole gamuts of them, can no longer sell their labour. And now they're subject to 0-hour contracts or working on the side or cash in hand. And it'll be largely people from those backgrounds who will be, it's like watching The Wire, you know, it's those people who will find other opportunities where they can have identity, they can have routine and purpose, they can make a lot of money, they can be somebody, because society won't allow them to be anybody.
So you think then social inequality obviously is a huge factor with who benefits from the use of drugs, or say if legalization of drugs, so if drugs were made legal, or say cannabis is legal, do you think then the social inequality plays a big factor into who benefits from that?
Legalization of cannabis doesn't really address the problem. I mean, I think to talk about legalization, I'd say that criminalization is disproportionately targeting the poor nearly all the time. So anybody who is white and appears to be middle class is highly unlikely to ever be done for possession. It's nearly always people of colour, indigenous people or poor people who'll get done for possession of drugs. So if you and I have a conversation, or you have a conversation with anybody from a more privileged disposition, they'll say, well, you know, actually all this business of drugs being illegal, it's not really a problem. And it isn't really a problem to white privileged people, but it's a hell of a problem to poor people in poor neighbourhoods and to people of colour, you know, black people and indigenous people. So the sooner that we can decriminalise and you know, further than that, decriminalisation I mentioned first because it's a step in the right direction, and it's something we could do overnight for all drugs. So it's dead easy. There's no sort of thrashing of ideas around in terms of, well, what do we do about this? And what, it's quite easy. We just simply overnight decriminalise all personal possession. We can decriminalise all cultivation and production for personal use. So all we've got to decide is what counts as personal use. But once you've done that, then it's fine. But after that, there's the more difficult process, which I would also support, which would be regulating and legalizing all drugs. So that would then take away all this law enforcement problem, because I think a lot of the problems we see, we don't have a global drug problem. We actually have a global drug policy problem. So a lot of the mess that I've began by talking to you about the social deprivation and the social situations that people need to address for when they've got addiction problems. But actually, there's a whole pile of people who haven't got any addiction problems at all. They're just being captured in the net, because the addiction problems are only about 7 to 10% of the people. The other 95% of people are just people who use drugs in the way that I'll grab a coffee or I'll grab a beer or whatever. But again, those people are the poor people. And so their lives are being harassed and ruined by the drug laws. So, as I say, the privileged and the white are not necessarily, by and large, being affected by the drug laws. So the drug policy harms are enormous, and they're drug law enforcement harms. So I would love to get rid of all this nonsense around drug laws, really, because it's untenable and it's not based on science.
Yeah, just what we were talking about, the social inequality and stuff there, and about heroin, and how the depiction, say, in the media or the propaganda that people use of a heroin addict, say, that they would call it. But people, I'm not talking Johnny Depp, but say people like Johnny Depp or these celebrities who would do drugs regularly, they get away with it. They don't have the same kind of stigma attached to them doing it as they would, lower class people, and they're targeted more, like you said. So that's what it, throws the statistics off.
That's right. I mean, there'll be loads of people who get done for drugs and who develop drug problems, who are rich and famous, and they'll be high profile. A lot of those people, sadly, I think quite a few of them end up in a mess because abstinence is pushed on them. So, like Amy Winehouse or Peaches Geldof or whatever, these characters often are given rehab and told to become drug-free, and they acquiesce and pretend that they want to become drug-free because that's the only option for them. But they get portrayed as being victims and sad people and people who need help, and in many ways that's fair enough, and that's also true. But the poor people are classed as being junkies and scum, and I mean the treatment of the poor who become struggle with addiction is awful. It's and I liken to it. It's institutionalized discrimination. In my view, the situation that we would have experienced for women or for gay, lesbian people in the 50s, or for black people in the 50s, it was normalized. Discrimination was towards those groups was normalized in the 50s and 60s to a point. And it's the same now for people who've got drug problems. I think there is a normalized discrimination embedded within the institution of society. And I don't think people can see it clearly. In the same way as if we were having this conversation in the 50s around black people, around sexuality, or women in positions of power, there'd be loads of people who just couldn't see what I'm talking about. And I think it's the same today in relation to drugs. So that if somebody's got if your neighbour has got a drink problem, there's no hostility or aggro or labelling of your neighbour because he's always coming or she's always coming home, drunk or whatever, or bladdered. But if your neighbour, he or she's got a methamphetamine problem or a heroin problem, then nobody's got any time for them, and we can all stick the boot in. But nobody really understands it either, which is the other side. So I think prohibition and the propaganda has affected the way that we see people, but I think it's also affected the way in which we misunderstand drugs, and we misunderstand addiction as well. So there's a whole spectrum of damage being created by the institutionalized misinformation we've got, really.
Yeah, well, what we're talking about then, the damage that it causes, I was going to, if you could talk about the laws that affect people long term, so the heavy penalties and the terms that come with cannabis and drugs like that, especially for the younger people who, say, at 18, 19, get arrested and charged and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think the greatest threat to our young people isn't drugs. The greatest threat to our young people is a criminal conviction. And if a young person gets done for a criminal conviction, then they're going to end up, having difficulties securing employment. They're going to have difficulties with international travel. They'll have difficulties with housing, difficulties with insurance, difficulties getting healthcare, maybe difficulties with education. And, they also have difficulties in networking and social relationships. If you're going out with somebody and you say, well, I've got a conviction for possession of methamphetamine, there's a whole story and a whole baggage you've got to overcome. And this is all because somebody chose to use a drug which the government have said is unapproved. And so if like say Class A drug in the UK, ecstasy, if you get done for a Class A drug, it's a really serious offence, or LSD or whatever. But actually, those two drugs are fairly benign in terms of the relative risk that they pose compared to, say, alcohol. So the risk of the drug is nowhere near as great as the risk of being labelled for the rest of your life. Your opportunities are ruined. So there's a greater harm created through criminalisation than there is through the drug. But there's this whole business of criminalizing drugs and having penalties. It's not based on any science. There's no science behind this classification of what we've called drugs. So I take issue really with people who talk about drugs as being what the UN have listed. So the UN have got a list of substances, a huge range of substances which they call drugs, or they might call them narcotics, and they call them dangerous drugs, but it doesn't have any science behind it. It's got no science or rationale behind it whatsoever. It was just a list drawn up, rooted in racism and propaganda in the 50s, in order to protect the dominant drugs, which were big sales and big businesses: alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine. And arguably, sugar's a drug, but that would be another debate in itself, really. But these are the main drugs that were imported from other countries, through the 1900s. And they became the dominant drugs which the Western world was able to circulate as being the drugs of choice for leisure, pleasure, relaxation, keeping you awake, helping you relax. So built into every day, it's like have a coffee break, have a tea break, start with a stimulant drug, end the day with a depressant drug. Alcohol, help you relax and celebrate every occasion with champagne or whatever. And so the other drugs, the opiums and the cannabis, they were used by the other. And so the people of color or the people from other ethnic groups, they were frowned upon. And that's why Harry Anslinger in the US referred to cannabis as marijuana, to give it an exotic feel that the other is using. But cannabis is a lot more benign than alcohol. So there's no reason whatsoever this separation makes any sense, because certainly alcohol and tobacco are more dangerous than most illegal drugs. And caffeine is arguably dangerous than a number of other legal drugs. It's not the most benign either. So there's no rhyme or reason to make sense of this separation. But I'd also argue that what you choose to ingest in your body is your business, and I can't understand how what anybody I know chooses to ingest is a matter for me or for law enforcement. I understand that if we do things that affect other people, then there are laws that can come into play. And of course, anything that we do that will affect other people, then that is an issue to us. But there's nothing inevitable about if I have a glass of beer, I'm likely to start, belting people or whatever. There are some people that do that, and we need laws to protect them from that. But you don't need laws to say that nobody should be allowed to take drug A, B, or C. We just need laws to protect us from consequences. But there isn't a drug that people take that suddenly turns them into something that's going to create problems more often than not to everybody else. But most of the problems we see in relation to illicit drugs are really caused by the culture of illegality. So that the whole culture becomes a subversive and underground culture, as opposed to a responsible, sensible culture. But equally, this is the other side of it, is that by separating drugs, with what I would call a drug apartheid, we've also given a very perverse and odd privileged position to alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine, which actually subverts the whole sensible and recreational use of those drugs. So we haven't got like a whole gamut of spectrum of drugs that you can choose from. You're actually, you can't watch a TV show tonight without seeing somebody open a bottle of wine and have a glass of wine. And I really enjoy my wine myself, but we are indoctrinated all the time into perceiving and constructing leisure and pleasure in relation to these particular drugs. Whereas really we should have a whole wide range of drugs for which we can choose from. So people will say, let's not introduce another problem, but we've introduced another problem already by privileging alcohol and elevating it so highly, when alcohol is one of the worst drugs you can think of. In terms of it's a poison, it damages the organs of your body, it's got a high dependency, it's got a physical tolerance, it's quite addictive. It's not the best drug to relax on or to socialize on. I do myself, but yeah. And the only, now I haven't taken an illegal drug, partly because I want to keep making these arguments to legalize drugs. And having done this for 40 years almost, I don't want to now have people undermine my position because my position is that this is entirely rational and scientific, and this isn't personal. I'm not in this for my own agenda. Not that other people who've used drugs are necessarily in it for their own agenda at all, but it just gives me a privileged position where I can say to those prohibitionists who might say, you just want to use drugs. And I'm saying, well, no, I've never used drugs in my life. I've been working in the drug field for 4 decades and seen the problems caused, not by drugs, but I've seen the problems caused by drug policy. And I've seen, the issues, and it's not all this mess that we've got on drug laws and drug policy is really not rooted in science, and we need an evidence-based approach in order to change this.
And if they were to say, the same people were to say that you are advocating for the legalization of these drugs, say, but are reforming drug policy, but have never used them, so you don't know how bad they can be or the effects on them. I mean, you've lived with them and been with them your entire life. You've seen what they can and can't do, so you're well in the know of what they can do.
Oh, that's right. No, I mean, I worked as a drug specialist. I've worked in Merseyside for the best part of 9 years, just working with people who've got addiction problems. And I've been in prisons and stuff all over the country in the UK. These are not people with mild issues. These are your hard end. People who are really struggling with chronic addiction for 10 and 20 years and whatever. And I've carried on, I've done research in that area too. So, so I've continued to see what the issues are. But having said that as well, I don't really subscribe to the idea that you have to be one to know one, so, the idea that because you've gone through the people who are ex-smokers are sometimes the worst people to help people with smoking habits or whatever. You know what I mean? I think it's really empathy and insight and an openness that gives you an informed view of what's happening. I don't dismiss the lived experience, because I think alongside empathy and insight and openness and the lived experience can come a much richer understanding. But the lived experience of its own can lead to all sorts of, perverse evangelism and very extreme views sometimes.
Yep. And so let's go back then on what you were saying before. How are the big pharmaceutical companies and big money, say, preventing the legalization of other drugs then, or are they?
Would you say that again? Sorry.
Sorry, so just to go back to what we were talking about before about the certain drugs that the Western governments would approve. So how much involvement do you think big pharmaceutical companies have now and big money in preventing the legalization of drugs?
Yeah, huge, massive. I think we are dealing with a whole system which is completely enmeshed and entwined with vested interest. So some people think that we need more research. We need more research. If we want to end prohibition, we need to show evidence or whatever. We've got wheelbarrow loads of evidence. And then people say, well, prohibition, it doesn't reduce demand. And prohibition doesn't reduce supply, and that's been proved. The UN in the latest World Report, the UN have shown that there's been ongoing increase in demand and in supply of drugs, throughout the years, for decades. So therefore, prohibition's failed. But prohibition hasn't failed. Prohibition has failed if that's what you think prohibition's about. But if prohibition is about protecting vested interest, then we begin to understand what prohibition's really all about. Because if we keep banging on the door of saying demand's still going up, then we're actually missing the point. So your question was about pharmaceutical companies. There's a whole range. I've written a blog around 20 groups who have a vested interest in prohibition. So that's what we've got to recognise, and that's what we've got to unlock. Because unless we realise who's benefiting from prohibition, and those people who are benefiting will be working behind the scenes, throwing money or dismantling arguments all the time. And that's where social media and where politicians and the spider's web of misinformation is vast. Now, I can't recite you the 20 groups, but I can just quickly knock off a few of them. So it's clearly in the interests of the alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco industry to not have competition. So when ecstasy was really popular, it was Red Bull who started campaigning against ecstasy. And when a young woman in the UK called Leah Betts died of ecstasy, there was a big campaign when I was a probation officer at that time saying just one E sorted. And it was made out that she died of just one ecstasy tablet. Well, that campaign was partly funded by Red Bull. And the fact of the matter is that Leah Betts had actually taken ecstasy prior to this one ecstasy tablet on her birthday. And her mum and dad, her dad was a police officer, and she was, it was all the abstinence approach, and she was afraid of being honest, and she drank too much water because she'd read up that you need to be careful if you take ecstasy because you might dehydrate and you lose your sense of how much water and whether you're dehydrating. And what killed Leah Betts wasn't an ecstasy tablet; it was drinking too much water. Her brain expanded, so that's what killed Leah Betts. But there's another case in the UK, and her name escapes me. She'll have to forgive me, but she's written a book around her daughter who died of ecstasy, and that was probably about 8 to 10 years ago. And this book is all about how her daughter died of ecstasy, and she campaigns now, this woman, to legalise drugs and to legalise and regulate all drugs, and because she realizes that her daughter died because she had hold of ecstasy, which was something like 75% pure, which is ridiculously pure, and killed her. Now that, normal levels of purity, in the same way as if I neck back a pint of beer now, and if it was 70% pure, it'd probably kill me if I necked it back in one go or whatever. But fortunately, when I get my, craft beer, I can look at it and it'll say it's 4.5% or it says 5.5%. And this is what you benefit from when it's regulated. So this woman knows that her daughter would never have taken 73% pure ecstasy. She was being very careful because she knew that I need to make sure I don't get contaminated stuff, because some of this ecstasy you buy is contaminated with poisons that will kill you. So she got some really good gear, but she had no idea the purity. So her mum now is kind of spending her life campaigning to regulate drugs, because when people buy drugs, they don't know what they're taking. They don't know the purity. They don't know if it's mixed with toxins, with stuff that can kill them. They have to mix in the underground world. They could be asked to, or pressured to start doing running, to take drugs and courier, and then they're enmeshed in. They have to take their drugs in secret places. They have to keep quiet about what they're doing. They can't seek help. Whereas if it's all out in the open, then people can start talking about it, and they can start getting help, and they can be more open and honest. So legalizing all drugs and regulating them is the way forward, by to reduce harm.
Yeah, there's one question I was going to ask you is how, all the people that are dying from tainted drugs, how can regulation and legalization help prevent that? But you've answered that now. But I don't know if you've ever compared it, I've never looked at it, but say to alcohol prohibition. So when people would have to make the alcohol in their bathtub or whatever, and it'd be ridiculously high, and they fill it in jars, and it kills people and it's poisonous. And then, don't know if you ever looked at similarities between that and the legalization of drugs, but the way they didn't, like, prohibition didn't stop people drinking alcohol. They just did it illegally and privately and secretly and dangerously.
You're spot on. Prohibition is the prohibition of a drug called alcohol. Do you know what I mean? So it's not different whatsoever. People talk about prohibition of alcohol as if like maybe it's got some connection. Well, it's the prohibition of a particular depressant drug that's a psychoactive drug. And as you said, we can learn from the prohibition of alcohol, because what that did is it meant that people didn't know what they were making. But what it also did is it created gangs and gangsters and violence. So when you prohibit drugs, you create a very lucrative market. The demand doesn't go away. So when you prohibit drugs, this is what the researchers found. So like you were saying you're in Dublin. Well, if you've got a regular supplier of illegal drugs in Dublin, then they're making a hell of a lot of money. And they'll have a patch, they'll have an area, they'll have a network, they'll have a hierarchy, and it'll be just like any employer. There'll be people with jobs and roles. Now, if the police under prohibition take that market, and they take the Mr. Big out of that market, then all of a sudden that supply goes. Now, what happens then is that the demand is still there. So somebody roundabout is going to move in and start selling. But those other people who are working for that business, they're going to start trying to recreate that business and try and keep hold of their customer base. And what you then do is you've got like you previously had a very stable market where people were buying and purchasing and acquiring their goods and knew who they were dealing with, and all of a sudden you've got competition and you've got rivalry. Now, you can't resolve any of this through the courts or through some tribunals. You resolve it by guns, knives, and baseball bats. And then, so what happens is there's research that's proven this, Werb et al. And what they found is that you remove people and you get tough on enforcement in the prohibition arena, then what you're creating is violence. So it's proven that the tough prohibition enforcement creates community violence. And then for the user, it obviously creates lucrative businesses as well. And for the user, that they don't know what they're taking, and they're more at risk. So what we've learned from prohibition of alcohol is exactly what we see for prohibition of all drugs. It just breeds violence, and it does not reduce demand. I think some of the instances show that alcohol was greater under prohibition than it was when it was legalized. And interestingly, where cannabis has been legalized, there's often less young people using cannabis when it's been legalized. So, here in New Zealand, we've got a referendum coming up in September where we're going to vote to see whether we're going to legalize cannabis. And there's loads of people who know little about drugs because we're in this environment of prohibition and people's minds have been filled with propaganda. And they think that what we're voting on is we're going to introduce drugs, we're going to introduce cannabis into the country. It's this nonsense that somehow or other, because we live under prohibition, people aren't doing cannabis. Whereas like research here shows that 80% of people have used cannabis. And you know, when I was lecturing, I used to do these live polls with people as part of the teaching, and I asked them about their drug use, and it was like massive. It's like sort of 80-90% had used cannabis in the last, you know, year or whatever. It's like loads and loads of people are using cannabis. So basically what we find is that use is not affected by legalization or regulation. You know, so for the logic of what the person on the street thinks that prohibition is about use and demand and supply, but you know, and that's what they're worried about. But prohibition is hopeless. It has no impact on demand and it has no impact on supply. But so they're fooled into thinking it's having a successful impact. It has no impact at all. So there's no benefit at all to the average person on the street. But it has lots of benefits, prohibition, to politicians, because they can get tough on drugs and it helps to win votes. It's great for the media. They can show all sorts of faces with rotten teeth before and afterwards. They can make us all these stories. And there's loads of propaganda, like crack babies, like drugs like crocodile, that's drugs that eat your flesh. There's the instantly addictive drug. There's the reefer madness. All these things are not true. None of these things are true. They're all propaganda stories that have been fueled, but they sell media. They're clickbait. And then, you know, it helps people get elected. And then it's for the police, it's wonderful because it means they can get their arrest quotas up. It's really easy to stop and search people. It's really easy to plant drugs in people's pockets. It's really easy to pull down funding if you need more funding. You talk about a drug problem. So there's like loads of groups that are benefiting from prohibition. And that's what we've got to understand, is that there's a whole industry now that doesn't want this to change. You know, and the pharmaceutical companies, you know, they don't want people using cannabis or acid or ecstasy for post-traumatic stress disorder or for epilepsy or for depression. But these drugs can have a considerable impact, you know, on Alzheimer's and autism. But you know, this is quite tragic, and you know, because people have got these conditions are being denied the medical benefits of these so-called banned illegal drugs, and that's tragic. You know, there was a young girl called Charlotte Figge, and she was having, you know, about 100 grand mal seizures a month, and her mum had, I think they were Catholics, and they'd actually had the last rites pronounced on her a couple of times because they were convinced, the medics were convinced that she wasn't going to come through this latest seizure, whatever. But anyway, in the end, it's over in the US, and in the end, they were trying everything they possibly could, and they came across a strain of cannabis high in CBD, and Charlotte Figge was given this cannabis, and it basically stopped her having seizures. And is it remarkable that they named a strain of cannabis called I think it's called Charlotte's Web. That's right, it's called Charlotte's Web. So it's a strain of cannabis high in CBD, which was named after Charlotte Figge, because this girl tried, her mum and dad, when she was about 6, tried this cannabis, and it virtually helped her to lead a normal life. And she was on tons and tons of anti-epileptic drugs, which were just turning into a cabbage. And I know about this. You know, I've got a son who's in his 30s, and he had epilepsy when he was 7, and or 10, or he started young, and we went through all sorts of, you know, anti-epileptic drugs, but nothing's really worked for him. But I was never had the opportunity of giving him cannabis when he was a child, and it might have made a difference. And it still could make a difference today, but, you know, he's still struggling to get hold of legal cannabis. But this is just like one example. I mean, there's Alzheimer's, where people have found great effect. There's autism. There's a whole range, and this is all part of this nonsense. So the pharmaceutical companies are threatened by that as well. But the other side of that coin is just the human, you know, the human tragedy of it all for people. And I would say it's the human tragedy of people, like here in New Zealand, there's like loads of people who are elderly who are excessively taking alcohol. And I'm thinking, well, it's not a good drug to take. If they could use cannabis, that would be a much healthier drug for them to take. It wouldn't damage the organs of the body. They'd be less likely to be falling down the stairs or whatever. And if an old person falls, they're likely to break a bone or whatever. And so, and the damage to the organs of the body, vascular dementia is another risk of alcohol and whatever. Whereas cannabis doesn't have those risks, So there's loads of tragedies caused by this system of prohibition and this madness that we live in.
After a certain point, it's the war on drugs. How long is the war going to go on for, and when do you reassess the way you're approaching it?
Yeah, and I've written an article called, I think I did it in 2000. I called it "The War on Drugs: The War on Drug Users," and that was talking about the way in which actually it's a personalised war on particular people. But now I'm saying there isn't a war on drugs. There's never been a war on drugs. And I'm saying there's a war on particular drugs and particular drug users because this construct of drugs is a social construct, because a drug is a psychoactive substance. And the prohibitionists have brainwashed us into thinking a drug is this thing that's on the list of the UN. And somehow or other, alcohol, tobacco, sugar, and caffeine are not drugs. And actually, they say, we'll say things like, is society ready to embrace drugs? And I think, you're having a laugh, aren't you? We use drugs all the time. Every minute of the day, people are using drugs to wake up, to get stimulated, to relax, to chill out. It's just that we're using illegal drugs. So let's not kid ourselves that we're not ready to embrace drugs. We love drugs, and we've always been doing drugs, and we carry on. So it's really a war on particular drugs, and it's on particular drug users. Going back to our earlier conversation of the poor, the disadvantaged, and the people of colour. So we do have this crazy drug apartheid that operates, and how long will this go on for? Well, I think we've got to expose it for what it is, really. And until we start exposing it for what it is, I think all we're going to be doing is skirting around the edges. So really, when we talk about legalising cannabis here in New Zealand, I'm glad about it, and I'm arguing and doing my bit to support it. But, all what we're doing is saying what we're in this drug apartheid. It's a little bit like, so to say, the South African apartheid, where the white population of South Africa enjoy all this power and privilege, and everybody of all the range of different coloured skins are not enjoying any privileges whatsoever. They're being abused. It's a bit like saying, well, okay, let's keep the system in place, but how about the Asian people joining the white people? You're not breaking the system. You're actually just taking one group and saying, come on to the other side and enjoy the privileges that we've got. So if we move cannabis or cocaine to join alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine and sugar on the top table, we're still peddling the whole structure of misinformation and propaganda. We're not being honest about the system that's corrupt and nonsensical. It's not based on science, that needs to be smashed. So I'm arguing that if I was in South Africa, I'd be saying, hang on, I'm not happy with that. This whole system needs to be smashed. This whole system is fundamentally wrong. It's not based on rationale. It's not based on logic. There's no science behind it. There's no proper reasoning behind this. I'm not happy about this. And that's my approach in drugs. I'm just not happy about this whole system of bifurcation, of separating these two lots of drugs on this basis. There's no sense in it whatsoever. And I know we've enmeshed and embedded this system, but like the Berlin Wall, or like the Iron Curtain, or like the apartheid in South Africa, this is a system that is going to be dismantled, and it's rooted in the 1950s and consolidated in the 1961 Single Convention, which was called a Single Convention because it brought all the previous conventions of the 1950s together in one convention at the UN. And like what was going on in the 50s and 60s was like, it's mad. You know, we wouldn't live by some of the values and the ideas that we're knocking about in the 50s and 60s, but we're still allowing ourselves to be shackled with this this prejudicial, discriminatory approach around drugs, which has no, you know, but people aren't willing to tackle it. People aren't willing to name it. You know, people embrace pragmatism. They say that, oh well, they won't tolerate this at the moment. We just got to try and legalize cannabis first. Well, it'll you know, you asked me how long will this go on for? Well, it'll go on for flipping decades and decades if we take one drug at a time. And I tell you what will happen is that when the people of privilege have their drugs of choice legalized, then they will start thinking less for the drugs that they are not using. So you'll end up with divide and rule. So there's a whole pile of people who enjoy using cannabis and cocaine, for example, who might be white and privileged, who just don't want to be involved in the underground market. Yeah, they're not being stopped. Yeah, they could probably get some good, nice, clean gear because they've got plenty of money or whatever. But they don't run the risk of a criminal conviction and all that business. They're likely to be immune from all that, but they want to get some clean. And so what you'll get from the white reformers in privileged positions is that they are really interested in a clean legal supply, because that will sort them. And once they're sorted, I don't think they will have the same empathy or passion for the people who are the real victims. I'm not even sure some of them have got the real empathy and passion now for the real, or they understand who the real victims are of the drug wars. And I'd prefer to call it the drug wars as opposed to the war on drugs now, meaning that they are the drug wars between drugs. So I don't know if that made sense to you about the way in which if we just take one at a time and we allow certain regulations, then the energy for change is going to be dissipated, because a lot of people have got what they want now and they're fine. But so what we're seeing with a lot of the cannabis legalization in say Canada or whatever and some other places is that law enforcement is still being bolstered, and the drug law enforcement agencies are still having increasingly more complicated arrangements to say things like, well, you can grow cannabis, but you can't grow it if it's on public display. Well, that will make it much harder for people who are in poor positions, who haven't got a big garden, who want to grow it on the flat windowsill or whatever. Well, they can't do that, and the police will carry on busting the usual suspects: the poor, the indigenous, the people of colour. So if we're not careful, we'll end up replicating the same law enforcement abuses that have always been there. Yeah. So we've, in my view, if we're serious about breaking down the drug wars, we've got to be serious about exposing what's really happening and challenging it and looking at the whole system. Now, I appreciate the whole system can't be broken overnight, but we've got to understand that that's where we're going. And I don't know that a lot of people understand that's where they're going. I think a lot of people think, well, actually, I'm really only interested in getting my cannabis legalized, or actually, I just want my cocaine legalized. And those people are only in it for a short, narrow focus, or some people are in it because they can see there's mega bucks to be made in the business. And so they're pouring their money into, so, a lot of people, there's a lot of people who are in the drug law enforcement agency who then move into the business and they run the businesses for cannabis. But there'll also be reformers who are also going to be pitching in with investments in the sales and stuff. And I'm not opposed to all that, but I just think we've got to remember the big picture here.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, what you were saying about how if they do it one piece at a time, it's like for decades and decades, and people would have to fight tooth and nail to get every little bit legalized. And when they do, it goes to the wealthy and the powerful first, and then it still sets it up impossible, impossible credentials or impossible qualifications that you're going to need to get it.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And the idea of saying, okay, can we legalize heroin? It promotes and gives credence to the system of prohibition. It gives it a sense that there are some drugs that make some sense prohibiting. There is no drug that it makes sense to prohibit. There is nothing positive achieved by prohibiting a drug. So it gives validity to a corrupt system that has no validity in the first place. So you're playing a game whereby you're presenting a drug as if somehow or other, whether we prohibit or legalize or regulate depends upon the risks of this drug. Well, no, there isn't any drug for which it's beneficial to prohibit. You know, and so really, I would say to people, give me the arguments. Tell me, explain to me why or how this drug or that drug or any drug at all benefits from prohibition. I can't see anything beneficial from prohibition of any drug whatsoever. You know, drugs are used in the highest security prisons in the world. There isn't a prison in the world that you can't get drugs in. So we know that you can't stop supply, and we know that the illegal supply is much more dangerous in so many ways. So, and what's it all about? You know, what's it all about? At the end of the day, it's your body, it's your choice. Let's let people make informed choices. Let them have clean drugs. Let them talk about it. Let them go for help if they need help. This whole underground culture, because the underground culture just creates mad and subversive identities and patterns of behavior, which are all to do with, like, whenever you see heroin, it's always in a dirty bag or whatever, because that's what the culture does. You can't read the back of the label and see what the ingredients are. You can't see, you know, the sell-by date or anything, because we've created that with the underground market. It's too risky for companies who are running underground to label and to package, and you know, so everything that the people do underground is such a mess and so dangerous. But the danger isn't the drug, the danger is the underground prohibited market.
Question, and I just want to see what you see as the way forward then. So is there a solution to the current policies that are in place? Like, what do we do? Where do we go from here?
The magic answer, as it were. Yeah. Well, I think we've got to understand the issue that we face, and I think, you know, I think being educated and informed and appreciating what the real issues are is the first thing. So I think, like, if we're trying, you know, and I think the best way to do that is to imagine and to look and learn from how the gay community have tackled homophobia, or to look at the way women have tackled sexism, or to look at the way Black people have tackled racism, because I think we are in the same institutionalized form of discrimination, and that remains. So it operates at a structural level, it operates at a cultural level, and it operates on a personal level. So we've got to appreciate what's going on here. How is it operating? But we're miles behind those groups, I think, in relation to drugs, and we're at a position where an awful lot of people haven't got much idea what we're talking about, and they don't realise they've been misinformed. They don't realise they've been misled. So most of my conversations are just about trying to help people appreciate the truth of the science, the facts. So on one level, for the people who've no idea, and it's about giving them the basic information. But then there's people who are in the cutting edge, who are in the reform movement, or people who do have ideas. And then for me, I'm more about saying, hang on, we need to be smashing the discourse which has been hijacked by the prohibitionists. There's no point in the reform movement embracing the propaganda and embracing a discourse that is full of misinformation. So let me put that a different way. It'll be a little bit like somebody saying, wherever you do, we want to try and get homosexuality legalized, but wherever you do, don't mention that we think we should be able to get married, because I don't want to mention that, because you know, pretend that we think that's wrong. And what we need to do is see this as a human rights issue. The whole drug thing needs to be presented. So people are saying, you know, I had somebody on Twitter recently said to me, I was having an argument with somebody on Twitter about legalizing cannabis. They were a prohibitionist, and they were saying legalizing cannabis is going to wreck society or whatever, and it'll lead to loads of our young people in New Zealand taking cannabis. And I was going through the arguments and saying, you know, it's just, there's no evidence to support that whatsoever. And I was arguing and saying, look, prohibition has no impact whatsoever on use or demand. And I'd written a piece which supported all this. And this person read this piece and said, so you're saying that you would legalize methamphetamine? So I was saying, well, yeah, I would legalize all drugs, and this is the reason why. Do have a read or whatever. So somebody else saying, look, will you just keep your mouth shut? This is somebody who's a reformer, was saying to me, keep your mouth shut, will you? Will you mind just keeping quiet till after the referendum? Because they're going to hide, they're going to jump on your back, and they're going to use the propaganda, and they're going to tell everybody, all these people want to legalize cannabis, they all want to legalize every drug, and so it's almost like you're being bullied with the propaganda. So it's almost like saying if you were gay and you wanted to legalize homosexuality or whatever, it's like, well, you've got to keep quiet about everything else because they'll get you. And people live in this fear, and what a lot of reformers are doing is they're playing along with the discourse of bullying and the discourse of misinformation, because they're afraid of speaking the truth. And I'm, you know, as I say, I'm still not using the legal drug, but I think it's important we start speaking honestly and we speak truth to power, and so, but as reformers, people are just wanting to achieve piecemeal progress. But I think we've got to smash and attack the heart of the issue through social action, through social media, through awareness. You know, and I've published in 40 or 50 journal articles and spoken at conferences at the UN and all around the world around drugs. But I don't think they have had much impact, because a lot of that stuff exists in a vacuum. It exists in inertia where it's not being disseminated. Whereas now, I wrote a piece around democracy and change around about 8 years ago. And it's around about 10 years ago, I shifted my position towards doing what I'm doing now with you. And I started setting up my own website and putting as much material on my website for free download as I possibly could, because I believe society is changing, and that this whole business of writing articles for academics to read, and most people are not seeing this stuff, and really, the internet has changed how the world changes, and stuff like Cambridge Analytica, and they've realised this. And so now people's hearts and minds are being changed through Instagram, through Facebook, through social media, through blogs and whatever, and through Twitter. So I've really gone big into committing, myself to Twitter and setting up, groups on Facebook and stuff, because I think that's where hearts and minds will change. And so that's where I think we need to get involved in social and political action. And so if I can affect, it's that sort of, chessboard, you put 1 grain on the first square, 2 on the second, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. Before you know it, if people keep influencing change. So if we do this video and it goes on YouTube, if people share it, then I think that could have a lot more impact than some of the best journals I've written articles for. And then if those people start talking to other people, then change will occur. And I think that's how the women's movement changed. I think that's how the gay movement changed. I think that's how race will change. The more we keep But we've got to be based on evidence, and we've got to be based on truth, and we mustn't start compromising or colluding with the discourse. And that's why I think the false discourse is like addiction is a brain disease. Well, that's prohibitionist propaganda. Or drugs are instantly addictive. That's prohibitionist propaganda. Or drugs are what's on the UN list. That's propaganda. We're not ready for drugs. That's propaganda. All these things are it's like all the seeds of misinformation that filtered through our heads as white people towards black people, that filtered through our heads as men towards women. And we were sown loads of different ideas around women, around black people, because that was the socialization process that we engaged with in our growing up. And we have to disentangle all that. And I think we've got the same work to do in relation to the drug apartheid. And there's no point there's no point or there's no place in compromising or embracing any of those false paradigms in relation to drugs. So that's how I see it working, really. But obviously there's the work with the general population, there's the work in social media, but there's also work with the cutting edge reformers, and sometimes I find myself having arguments with the reformers who don't always see eye to eye with my perspective because of what I've shared, really. I think they would say they're being pragmatic and they're making small changes. But my concern is it could be a sellout, because if you keep peddling or not challenging the false paradigms, then that's going to run for a long time.
If you get your foot in the door with anything, with any movement, any reformation, if you just start with getting your foot in the door and take that, it takes decades and decades and decades to eventually get where you want to be, if you ever get there at all. You know, you might just do a little bit and only get a little bit, and then that's it.
Yeah, and people who mix with the people in power, sadly sometimes go native and they become like them, and that's, you know, you see that in all walks of life. The people who are willing to make compromises and start embracing some of the discourses that you find offensive and you don't agree with, but they tell you that they're doing that on the basis of trying to broker a deal, then often you get shafted. And you know, so I'm not comfortable with that approach, really.
Yeah, and then just one thing that I think is important for people to understand what you said, it made me think about, I was talking to Dr. Todd Boyd, he's in USC in America, and he was saying that one of the differences he notices in these Black Lives Matter protests is how many white people there are. So he's saying that not necessarily that all white people are racist, but racism doesn't affect them, so they don't pay as much attention to it and therefore don't take any action, and they think that there's no issue because they haven't seen the issue. What you were saying about the way people just approach drugs, they remind me of it's the exact same, where people like me, and say yourself, right, you, because of your job and your profession, were around it. I don't do drugs and I never have, and I'm not around it, so I don't know that there's an issue unless I go and research and investigate and actively try and find out, like doing this. So it's mostly, if it exists in that vacuum where it's just people in power or just people who use drugs, it's not going to work. It needs to be the people who are in the middle, who don't use drugs, who aren't involved in it. They need to research and get involved, and that's how change happens.
Very, very much so. And it is an issue that affects all of us, really, whether we realize it or not, because those, you know, my neighbors or whatever who don't use drugs and who have no interest in illicit drugs, they're actually being damaged because of what I was saying before, is that they've been indoctrinated into thinking that alcohol, tobacco and caffeine are sound choices that they're exercising. And they could be exercising a much wider range of choices which have an awful lot more benefits to them medicinally or in terms of their leisure, pleasure, relaxation or whatever. So you know, they're in an ignorant position, but they are also being damaged. So they do need to have a stake in this, really, because, and some of them are being damaged by misinformation because they don't appreciate how toxic or difficult the drug alcohol is, because it's been bombarded with them all the time. But then the other issue is that any injustice is an injustice that affects us all, and we're all part of the same society. And if there's people being pulled and incarcerated, I mean, here in New Zealand, 15% of the population are Maori, and 51% of the prison population are Maori. So the Maori people are being pulled and incarcerated, and it's like 1 in 10 people incarcerated in New Zealand are incarcerated for drug-defined crimes. So drug-defined crimes is not drug-related. It's possession, utensils, supply, cultivating, growing, or whatever. So 10% of the population in prison are there, and these figures are similar in the UK and all over the place. It's so this is a justice issue. It's not just we're not just talking about my choice or your choice or their choice, or whatever. We're talking about justice, and we're talking about people's lives being ruined and people being imprisoned and stuff. And in some countries, like the Philippines, people are being killed. This is this is an issue that does affect us all. Really, it's not about just a small group of people and their personal choices. It's a justice issue for us all, really. And I think if you've got serious injustices in your community and in your society, you've got damage for all of us, really. It doesn't make sense. It's not easy or comfortable to live when you're living in a system which is corrupt and which is not based on science, my two sons haven't been busted for drugs or whatever. But if when they were 17 or 18, if they got busted for drugs, it would really ruin their life, So they're lucky, but, if another young kid gets done for drugs, it could ruin their life with the conviction. It's not right. It doesn't make sense. We should fight it. Right?
Is there anything that I didn't cover or ask that you want to talk about?
I think we've had a pretty free-ranging conversation. I hope I haven't bombarded you with too much talk, but I've been enjoyable having a good chat about it.
Thank you again for taking the time. I really appreciate it.